You know that feeling when you're just browsing online, maybe clicking accept all on cookies?
We all do it.
Without really, knowing what you're agreeing to. Or you use some free tool and think, hang on, what's the catch here?
Yeah, the little voice in the back of your head.
Exactly. Well, turns out that little niggle, it's often right. Today, we're diving deep into something called web exposure. And it's actually a much bigger deal than just the usual cybersecurity check.
It really is. When we talk security, people usually think firewalls, antivirus, the stuff you actively install.
Right, the defenses.
But web exposure, that's about the weaknesses lurking in the everyday online experience itself, often in places we just don't think to look.
Right, right. And this deep dive, it's specifically for you, the learner. We know you want to understand the real risks on sites you use, daily work, hobbies, news, whatever, without getting totally overwhelmed.
How?
So our mission today is to pull out the key insights from, really interesting mix of sources. We've got a 2025 web exposure report, a guide for becoming a pen tester.
Yeah, Docker security docs, Active Directory basics.
Guides on vulnerability assessments, security operations centers, even a physical pen test report and stuff on high performer habits. It sounds like a lot, I know.
It's definitely a broad set of materials. But the thread tying it all together is understanding and tackling risk in today's digital world, which is just getting more complex, right?
Totally.
We want to stitch these different views together so you get a clear picture of web exposure, what it is, why it matters to you, and, what can actually be done.
Okay, let's get into it then. This expanding web exposure landscape. What does that actually mean? Sounds a bit dramatic.
Well, it kind of is, in a way.
Yeah.
Modern websites aren't simple pages anymore. They're incredibly intricate. Think about all the third-party apps, plugged-in widgets, embedded features, you name it.
Make chat boxes or social media feeds.
Exactly. And trackers monitoring activity, open-source tools doing various jobs, embedded videos, analytics tools, tracking clicks, share buttons. Each one is basically a separate bit of code, often from a totally different company.
Huh. So it's like a mini city built on one web page. But how does that make things riskier?
Because every single one of those outside elements is a potential weak point. The 2025 Web Exposure Report really drives this home.
Yeah.
And here's a shocker. Marketing and digital teams. They're linked to about 50% of the risk exposures found.
50. Seriously. Not IT.
IT comes next at around 37%.
Yeah.
It's not that these teams are being careless on purpose. You know? It's just that the tools they use for their jobs, driving engagement, analytics, advertising, can bring security baggage with them.
Wow. I always just assumed security was. That's a problem. That really changes how you think about who needs to be involved.
It's a super common thought. But yeah, marketing often focuses on features, user experience. Maybe security isn't the first thing considered when grabbing that cool new widget. And the report stresses these risks often fly under the radar of traditional security tools, which are usually looking at the core website tech.
So if it's so complex, how do we even know if a site is risky or not? Is there a way to measure it?
Yeah, the report uses something called an exposure rating. Think of it like a grade, A to F. A is low risk, F is high.
Okay.
And what's really interesting is most websites land somewhere in the B or C range.
B or C. So like average to slightly risky?
Pretty much.
Yeah.
It suggests there's just this baseline level of risk kind of baked into the internet now.
Even on big, respectable-looking sites.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it varies by industry. Government, healthcare, finance, they tend to do better, often scoring a B, probably due to tighter regulations, right?
No sense.
But then you look at entertainment, retail, even publishing. They often sit at a C, higher risk. Think about all the ad trackers on a news site or all the payment methods on an online store. Each adds a layer.
Okay, so the web is complex, risk is common. What are the main culprits then? What specific things are driving this exposure?
The report points to 5 main factors. First, trackers grabbing your personal data. Big privacy issue there. Second, third-party apps getting access to sensitive data, name, address, health info, that kind of thing. Third, apps running inside payment iframes. You know, those little boxes on checkout pages.
Yeah, where you type your card number.
Exactly. Risky if not locked down. Fourth is loading stuff from public content delivery networks, CDNs. That's a supply chain risk. And fifth, just using apps that aren't very popular, maybe less vetted for security flaws.
Can you break that down a bit more? Like, how does this look in different sectors?
Sure. The numbers are pretty stark. In retail, a whopping 70% of the risk comes from excessive tracking. All those ads following you around, trying to figure out what you'll buy next.
70%.
Yeah. And in entertainment, 61% of the risk is tied to those third-party apps running inside payment iframes, which is worrying, given how many transactions happen there.
You mentioned sensitive data. What falls under that umbrella? Sounds serious.
It is. We're talking personally identifiable information, PII, your name, social security number, birth date, also protected health information, PHI. And the report flags data about children as highly sensitive, too. And the scary part is, a lot of third-party apps access this stuff without a clear business reason.
Without needing it. How often does that happen?
Overall, about 44% of the time, according to the report. But it's worse in some areas. Retail, it's 53%. Entertainment, it's up at 59%.
Wow. What kind of apps are doing this?
Well, the common ones are tag managers tools used to manage other tracking scripts, social media pixels, and advertising tools. They make up a big chunk of that unjustified access.
Okay, back to those iframes on payment pages. Why are they such a weak spot?
Because that's literally where you're typing in your credit card details, your security code. Super sensitive stuff.
Yeah.
And the report found that 45%, nearly half of the apps running inside those payment iframes, can access that sensitive input without a good reason.
That's not good.
Not good at all. And some industries are worse than others. Entertainment sites average 8.5 apps in their payment iframes. Retail is close behind at 7.5. That's a lot of potential listening posts during a critical moment.
Okay, and public CDNs. I thought they just made websites load faster, like storing copies closer to people.
They do speed things up, yeah. They distribute website content globally. But because they're run by third parties, they create a supply chain risk. If that CDN provider gets hacked,
Then all the websites using it could be affected.
potentially, yes. It could be used to push malicious code. Most industries only use 1 or 2 apps from public CDNs, but it's still a vulnerability point to watch.
Okay, got it. Lots of ways data can get exposed. Let's talk more about these trackers. We know they follow us, but what's the actual danger?
Well, these technologies, cookies, pixels, browser fingerprinting, which is more advanced, they gather a ton of data about you.
Yeah.
Browsing habits, device info, IP address, even how you move your mouse on a page, often without you explicitly saying okay or even knowing.
Right.
The risks: privacy invasion, obviously, data breaches if that collected data gets stolen, identity theft, even manipulation through super targeted ads, or maybe worse.
It feels like the more trackers a site piles on, the riskier it gets. Is there like a threshold?
The report suggests so, yeah. Sites with 13 or more trackers are much more likely to show signs of malicious activity compared to those with 6 or fewer.
13. Okay.
Also, compromised websites tend to talk to way more web domains, like 100 different addresses versus 44 for safe sites, and they have nearly double the number of third-party apps running 36 versus 20.
Interesting indicators.
And another big one, missing security instructions called HTTP headers. 70% of compromised sites are missing important ones, compared to 50% of safe sites. Think of them as security settings set between your browser and the server. Missing ones leave doors open.
Which industries seem to attract the most of this malicious activity?
According to the report, entertainment leads at 4.5% of sites showing issues, then publishing at 4%, and healthcare at 3%. Could be the value of the data, or maybe just the nature of those sites.
You mentioned social media pixels again. Why are they grabbing personal data, and what's the worry, especially on sensitive sites?
They're built to track you for ad targeting and analytics. That's their job, right? So they collect browsing history, device details, interactions, data that is personal. When this happens on, say, a health website or a financial portal, it raises huge privacy red flags, and legal ones. Companies are supposed to configure these things carefully, limit sensitive data collection.
But they maybe don't always know how or don't prioritize it.
That seems to be the implication, yeah. The default settings might be too broad, and maybe the effort isn't always put in to lock them down properly.
So it really sounds like many risks come from the very tools websites need to function and grow. Who's actually initiating these exposures most often?
Well, like we said, the report points to IT departments being involved in about 37% of cases, but marketing and digital teams, they're often the source of the critical risks.
Okay.
IT's risks often relate to those public CDNs or apps accessing sensitive inputs. Marketing's big one tends to be those apps running in payment iframes.
Right. Different tools for different jobs leading to different risks. So what can companies do? What are the practical steps to dial down this exposure?
There are definitely best practices. Number one, limit third-party stuff, especially on really sensitive pages like login or checkout. The report notes leading retail sites use about half the average number of apps. That's significant.
Fewer moving parts, fewer risks.
Exactly. Then strengthen security configurations.
Yeah.
Really inspect the trackers being used. Try to minimize public CDN reliance. Maybe avoid apps that are brand new or not widely adopted.
Makes sense.
And crucially, foster collaboration. Marketing, IT, security, they need to talk to each other, understand each other's priorities and risks.
Break down those silos.
Absolutely. Implementing continuous monitoring, perhaps using those exposure ratings we talked about, helps track risk over time. And simple things, too. Be wary of domains registered very recently, say less than 6 months ago, and regularly check what data your trackers are actually accessing.
This all sounds pretty specialized. How does something like traditional penetration testing fit in? Do pen testers look for this stuff?
Oh, definitely. That's a key part of it. The Guide on Becoming a Penetration Tester talks about VAPT, vulnerability assessment and penetration testing. That's literally about finding these kinds of web weaknesses.
Actively hunting for holes.
Precisely. Pen testers use tools like Nmap to map networks, OpenVAS to find known software flaws, and OWASP-ZAP, which is specifically for web app security testing. The vulnerabilities they hunt for SQL injection, cross-site scripting, XSS, cross-site request forgery, CSRF, these are the technical root causes of many of the risks in the web exposure report.
Okay, so the pen testers are like the detectives finding the clues. Then what? Who acts on their findings?
That's often where a Security Operations Center, or SOC, comes in. The SOC document describes it as like a command hub. They're constantly monitoring the organization's systems for threats and responding to incidents.
Like a digital watchtower.
Kind of, yeah. They collect logs, analyze activity, look for anomalies. They use tools called SIEMs. Splunk is a common one to manage all that data. But you need skilled analysts to interpret it and react. Tools like Osquery and Sysmin can also feed detailed endpoint data into the SOC for analysis.
It's a whole ecosystem, isn't it? Does physical security play any role here? Seems separate.
You'd think so, but yeah, it can connect. The physical pen testing report we looked at from TCM Security showed how attackers might try to bridge the physical and digital worlds.
How so?
Like if they can tailgate into an office and plug something into the network, that could bypass a lot of digital defenses. The report mentioned things like weak door controls, but also simple stuff like passwords on sticky notes. They called it insufficient clean desk controls.
Wow. Passwords on sticky notes. Still happens.
Apparently so. And these physical gaps can become digital threats. It all ties back to broader frameworks like ISO 27001, which pushes for managing security risks everywhere. Physical, digital, third parties, the lot.
Okay, time for that technical aha moment you mentioned. Docker. Containers. How does that fit into web exposure?
Right, Docker. It lets developers package apps and all their dependencies into these neat little boxes called containers. Makes deployment way easier.
Consistent environments?
Exactly.
Yeah.
But the Docker pen testing document highlights risks. A big one is if Docker's control interface, the API, gets accidentally exposed online, usually on port 2375. That can let attackers just walk in remotely and potentially hijack the containers.
Yikes.
Yeah. There are tools like Claire to scan container images for known flaws, and Bench Security to help harden the configurations. But the link to web exposure is direct. Developers run web apps inside these containers. So a vulnerability in the container setup itself, that becomes a web exposure risk for the application running inside it.
So even the building blocks need to be secure. It's layers upon layers.
It really is. And it's not just tech, right? The human side is huge.
How do you mean?
Well, that piece on high performers, success isn't luck. It talks about habits like being proactive, continuous learning, taking ownership. Those apply directly here. Fighting web threats isn't a one-off task, it's ongoing.
Right.
And remember the sticky notes, that physical pen test finding. A perfect, tangible example of how individual habits affect security for everyone. Plus, as the exposure report showed, getting teams marketing, IT security talking and working together instead of in silos. Absolutely essential.
Makes total sense. Lastly, you mentioned Active Directory briefly. It's a Windows thing, right? How is it relevant?
Yeah, Active Directory, or AD, is kind of the central nervous system for managing users and computers in many Windows environments. The beginner's guide stresses secure configuration. Why? Because if AD is misconfigured, think of weak passwords, unpatched flaws in protocols like SMB or Kerberos, it could be a gateway for attackers.
A gateway to what?
To gain wider access across the network. This could potentially include the servers hosting web apps, or maybe even ways to compromise the web apps indirectly. So securing that core infrastructure is vital for reducing vulnerabilities that might eventually be exploited via the web.
Wow. Okay. That is a lot to process. Web exposure is definitely way more tangled and pervasive than I thought.
It really is. So just to quickly recap the big points, web exposure is a major, often overlooked risk. It's fueled by how complex websites are now and how much we rely on third-party code. Understanding the key risks, tracking sensitive data access, iffy third-party components, and taking proactive steps across the whole organization is crucial.
And just to be clear, the point of this deep dive isn't to make everyone paranoid.
Not at all, no.
Yeah.
It's about empowerment, giving you, the learner, the knowledge to understand the landscape better, maybe ask better questions, make smarter choices.
Okay, so here's a final thought for you to chew on. Think about the websites you use every day. How many of those third-party bits and pieces are running silently? What data might they be hoovering up? And maybe more importantly, what steps can you take personally or in your organization to be more mindful of web exposure? This conversation, this deep dive, it's really just scratching the surface. We definitely encourage you to dig deeper into these ideas and maybe check out some of the tools we mentioned.